Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our conversation today with Professor Lorraine Bannai. My name is Amaryllis Garcia Perez. I am an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations, director of the Pre-Law Advising and Training Office, practicing attorney in the state of Florida, and moderator for today's conversation. This presentation is hosted by the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series and co-sponsored by the Asian Studies Program, the Pre-Law Advising and Training Office, the Vaclav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, and Books and Books. So on behalf of myself and all who have worked very hard to organize this program for you tonight, I thank you for the opportunity to bring awareness to the very relevant and important issue of racial profiling by remembering the experiences of Fred Korematsu and the entire Asian American population during the World War II era. And I ask that as we reflect today on the incidents of the past, that we recognize that in understanding the mistakes of the past, we can prevent those of the future. So I'm going to briefly welcome Professor Bannai, an attorney, professor emerita at Seattle University School of Law, Director Emerita of the Fred Korematsu Center for Law and Equality, and author of Enduring Conviction, Fred Korematsu and His Quest for Justice. Professor Bannai joins us this evening to tell Fred's story. And on behalf of everyone here today, we welcome you, Professor Bannai, and are grateful for your time. And before we go and we start talking a little bit about your journey, not only in writing this book, but in knowing Fred Korematsu and knowing this case that we read in the history books from a very different perspective, I want to give a little bit of a background for those attendees that may not be as familiar with the case. So let me just start by giving us a little bit of background. During World War II, Fred Korematsu, like many students that are attendees here today, was a young man. He was 22. He was an American citizen born in the United States. His name is in the history books because he was courageous and opposed racial-based imprisonment. But he wasn't a political activist, yet he opposed race-based imprisonment, like I said. He defied military relocation orders that mandated all persons of Japanese ancestry, whether they were American or born in the United States or not, that they relocate and that they leave their homes, their property, and move to the West Coast to what were called camps, but basically internment camps. He simply felt that his rights as an American were being taken away without any due process. He was arrested and convicted and appealed the conviction to the United States Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the United States, accepting the government's argument of military necessity, that it was necessary to isolate individuals based on their race and profile them because there was military urgency. Yet interesting, none of these individuals were ever found to be spies, or was there any foundation for this military necessity. So 40 years later, after his arrest and conviction, a brave group of young lawyers with few resources, but with a strong desire to right a wrong, reopened the case. And in 1983, Korematsu's conviction was vacated and the underlying indictment dismissed. This was done by way of quorum novus, which is a very unusual way of reopening a case. What these young lawyers did was incredible in the legal world. A federal judge ruled that the government's argument in support of relocation orders had relied upon, quote, unsubstantiated facts, distortions, and representations of at least one military commander, whose views were seriously infected by racism. So Lorraine Bannai, who has asked that I call her Lori today, as she was referred to with the group of lawyers, was part of that legal team. Since then, she has been a faithful caretaker of Korematsu's legacy through her work with the Fred Korematsu Center for Law and Equality. She has written and spoken widely on the issue of wartime incarceration, including testimony before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, and she has co-authored an amicus brief in Hedges versus Obama in federal court, which in 2012 opposed unwarranted detention of people for their suspected political beliefs. She helped draft a brief opposing President Donald Trump's travel ban and has championed an effort to award honorary degrees to Japanese Americans who, as students in 1942, were forced to withdraw from their studies at Seattle University in order to report to the internment camps. Her writing includes a biography of Fred Korematsu, Enduring Conviction, Fred Korematsu and his quest for justice, which is what brings us here today. I had the privilege to read this book in preparation for my constitutional law course and have shared it with my students. And I asked Professor Bannai to come and speak to us because I found that the story she tells in the book is much more than a legal perspective on a case. It tells a very personal story. And I would like, Lori, for you to share that with us today and tell us about Fred Korematsu in this case that you participated in.
So let me start out with, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And also for your work in advancing Fred's story, and also for all your work in putting together this program. I really, really appreciate being able to be here. And I appreciate all of you who are joining us here in the audience. I know you're certainly invited to put questions that you have in the Q&A, and Amaryllis will be monitoring it and see if we'll be able to get to some of those. I hope we'll be able to get to your questions and engage in a discussion today. I want to start out by just kind of talking a little bit about my connection to this issue and to the book. I think that just kind of provides you a way to know me and why this was such a work of passion for me. I am a third generation Japanese American. Let me share my screen here and show you just a little bit of my background here. Can you see this, this picture? So I am a third generation Japanese American. That is, my grandparents immigrated from Japan to California and to the Colorado area in the early 1900s. In 1941, my mother, here shown, Hideko Matsuno, was 16 years old. She was a second daughter of 4 girls raised by a single mother who was widowed when my mother was 10. My father was a 21-year-old bank teller in Little Tokyo, Los Angeles, Little Tokyo, here on your right. My parents, my aunts and uncles during World War II were all incarcerated at the Manzanar Center, Manzanar Camp, incarceration camp in the desert of the Owens Valley, California. Here on the upper left, you'll see a picture of the barracks at Manzanar, where 10,000 persons of Japanese ancestry were incarcerated. Others were incarcerated in desolate camps around the United States. 2/3 of the 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry who were incarcerated were, like my parents and my aunts and uncle, American citizens. On the bottom right, you'll see a picture of my grandmother, my father in his Army uniform, visiting camp with his sister and his little brother in front of a barracks at Manzanar. My father volunteered to serve in the armed services, and he was actually fighting in the South Pacific doing military interpretation when he was too disloyal to be able to return to his home, and his family was being held in camp. One of the incredible, ridiculous aspects of the wartime incarceration. My parents never spoke about their incarceration when I was growing up. That was really not unusual for people my age not to know about their parents' experiences. They talked about camp. Every once in a while I would hear about camp, and I wasn't really quite sure what they were talking about because, of course, my only notion of camp was Girl Scout camp, but it was pretty clear they weren't talking about that. Karen Korematsu, Fred's daughter, tells a story that's discussed in the book about how the first time she heard about her father's case and about his criminal conviction during World War II was after hearing a report by a friend of hers in a high school class. And she came home and asked her father if that was the same Korematsu. So our parents didn't talk about it. They really just had the attitude about not wanting to burden their children with it, needing to move on. needing to put the past behind them. I learned about the camps in my own Asian American Studies camp, my own Asian American Studies class in college. And so these classes that you're taking right now, teaching you about this history of what's happened to communities of color in this country, Japanese American, Black, Latino, whatever, are fairly recent developments. In the early 1970s, people were fighting to have these classes exist so that we could learn about our own history. And indeed, I learned my family's history in these classes. Further, like every other lawyer in the country, I don't know about Amaryllis, I haven't asked her, I read the Korematsu case in law school. It's kind of standard reading in law school classrooms across the country. And of course, I was shocked and appalled that I knew my parents and my family had been incarcerated during World War II, but I did not know that the US Supreme Court held that it was constitutional. And it was just unbelievable to me that the highest court in the country would say that there was military necessity to put Japanese Americans away in camp. Of course, the question was there anything that could be done about the case? In 1981, as Amaryllis just said, I was a young lawyer, 26 years old, not a whole lot older than the people I think in these classes. I was 2 years out of law school working in Oakland, California, in a really small private practice. There were only 6 of us in one of the first all Asian American law firms in the country. We served mom and pop clients and small businesses in our community. And in addition to our practices, personal injury, advising businesses, family law, immigration, criminal defense, we also took on pro bono work that sought to protect and advance the interests of our Asian American community. To tell you a little bit about the story, one day my partner Dale said he had just received a call from a professor who had found evidence that might be useful in reopening the Korematsu case. And of course, again, we had read that case in law school. We were utterly intrigued by the idea that there might be a way to challenge that case. Peter, the professor who had found these documents, was not a lawyer. He had heard of our work that Dale and I and others had done to obtain reparations for Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated during World War II. And so we arranged to meet him, and the evidence was shocking. I can't go into a lot of detail about it, but kind of the quick and dirty discussion of it is that it was evidence that the government, while it was arguing Fred's case during World War II, suppressed, altered, and destroyed material evidence while it was arguing before the Supreme Court. The court first said it had no role in judging what the government does in the name of national security, which is something I'll come back to later on, a very dangerous proposition. But even though it said it had no role, it went on to say that it agreed with the government's argument that the mass removal of Japanese Americans was a military necessity for several reasons, including number one, that Japanese Americans had certain racial characteristics that made them prone to disloyalty and prone to attachment to Japan. And then secondly, that there was insufficient time, that the government argued and the court agreed that there was insufficient time to separate the loyal from the disloyal. Now that on its face is a suspect argument, number one. I mean, really, because it was Pearl Harbor happened the beginning of December and the first Japanese Americans were removed in March. And so there was intervening almost 4 months there, but the government still argued that there was insufficient time to separate the loyal from the disloyal. Peter Irons, in the evidence that he brought to us, showed basically two main things. Number one, that the government, when it was arguing Fred Korematsu's case, had within its possession intelligence reports by the government's own intelligence agencies, the Office of Naval Intelligence, the FBI, and the Federal Communications Commission, basically saying that any claims of race-based disloyalty were foundless, any claims of illegal shore-to-ship signaling or illegal radio transmissions were baseless, and the government knew about it, was advised by one of their attorneys that the government had a duty to give this to the Supreme Court, and he was overruled. These reports were never given to the Supreme Court, even though the government knew that contrary evidence existed within their own files. Secondly, there was a report by Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, who was the commander of the Western Defense during World War II. And the government gave a copy of his report to the Supreme Court to explain why the military thought that this was necessary. However, one thing that Peter Ahrens found, in addition to these suppressed intelligence reports, was that the report, DeWitt's report given to the Supreme Court, was an altered version of his original report. His original report that he wrote said that Japanese Americans were removed from the West Coast not because of lack of time. Lack of time had nothing to do with it. Instead, it's because you could never tell a loyal Japanese American from a disloyal one, no matter how much time you had, because their racial strains are undiluted. When the government found out that DeWitt's report contradicted their argument before the Supreme Court, DeWitt's report was altered to say that time was a factor in deciding to incarcerate Japanese Americans. The court was given the altered version of the report. The original reports were all ordered destroyed and burned. However, one copy of the original report was not destroyed. And the soldier who burned the copies left a copy of his memo saying, "Today, I burned all these copies of this report." And we were able to use this evidence to reopen Fred Korematsu's case. Our team represented Fred Korematsu in San Francisco. I'll show you a picture here. Of me when I was very, very young. Our legal team was formed in San Francisco. There were probably about a dozen of us, more than the few people indicated here. We represented Fred Korematsu in San Francisco. Two other legal teams were formed in Seattle, Washington. One in Seattle, Washington, representing Gordon Hirabayashi, and one in Portland, Oregon, representing Minya Sui, two other men who were convicted of after violating the government's wartime orders, and who also took their cases up to the Supreme Court. And so these cases were brought together. You'll see in this picture my colleagues. You'll see Fred Korematsu sitting in the front and center, and you'll see me looking extremely young there on the right. The first time we met Fred and his wife, Catherine, in their living room in San Leandro, he was a warm and gracious person. He was easy to be around. He reminded me of my own uncles. He was very soft-spoken, but he spoke with conviction. When we first met him, we talked about moving forward on his case. He thought we looked like a bunch of high schoolers, but in the end, he came to trust us. Over the time we worked together, Fred, his wife, Catherine, and his children, Karen and Ken, came to embrace us as family. They asked how we were doing, whether we were taking care of ourselves, and they became certainly lifelong friends. If you're interested, I'm glad to talk more about our work on the case, but I'll mention just a few things. The people I was able to work with on Fred's case was the most amazing group of people I've ever had a chance to work with. They were committed, smart, highly passionate. Mostly, we were third generation Japanese Americans whose families had been incarcerated during the war. And we saw the cases not only as Fred's case, but also the case for our families and our community, and the trial that our families had never had. There was tons of hours. If you want to become a lawyer, as Amaryllis can share with you, it's a lot of work. We did our daytime work, our personal injury cases and our family law cases, and then at nights and weekends, we did our legal research on this case. We reviewed tons of documents. We drafted briefs to the courts. And then in addition, we also engaged in public education. We went out and we spoke about the case because we felt that even just as important as it was to win the legal case, it was really important to win the public case. It was really important to win in the court of public opinion. And I can talk more about this, but I think that we all have the perspective that the law is limited as a means to correct injustice. That basically you can have a law. There were laws during World War II, and yet the incarceration happened. Instead, what you really need is an educated and informed public. And so it's really important to us to go out and to educate the public about what had happened during World War II, what the evidence showed in Fred's case, for a couple of reasons. One is to talk to our community so that they were educated. Two is to educate the American public. And three, to help us raise money to support the case. We are working pro bono, that is without pay. And we needed money for postage and photocopy fees and things like that. And so we went and we spoke to groups of Japanese Americans, many being our own parents and our own aunts and uncles who helped support our case. The government made a motion to dismiss the case. The court denied that motion and instead entered a ruling for Fred vacating his conviction. Very exciting day. It was a decision in a case that Japanese Americans had waited for 40 years. The courtroom was packed of people who had been encamped to hear the judge speak, as well as their children. He went on after his case was over. Then he could have just sat back and said, I won my case, right? But instead he went on to crisscross the country and talk about his case. He didn't have to. He didn't have to reopen his case and he didn't have to go and speak about it. But he saw what was happening to people who were Muslim, people of Middle Eastern descent. After 9/11, he was really concerned about the targeting of other groups suspected of espionage or harming the country, just like Japanese Americans had been. So he began to speak across the country to ensure that nothing similar could ever happen again. He was received warmly. He received standing ovations everywhere he went. And this was not because he was a powerful or eloquent speaker. He actually was not. But what he was sincere. And he told a really compelling story about doing what's right and speaking up against injustice. And it was my privilege to join him on many of these trips, and members of our legal team joined him as well. They became like a second set of parents, and I will always treasure that time together.
So I remember reading in the book, you know, and that's why I said in my introduction that he really wasn't a political activist. He wasn't someone that liked the attention. He wasn't trying to garner any mass movement. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the things that was offered was to just basically set aside the order, and you all wanted it vacated because it was more than just like you said, it had to be a public victory. It had to show not only that maybe there isn't, you know, the consequence legally that you're thinking about, but that it had to be shown that it was wrong, that what was done without the necessary legal foundation. And when you talked about, I thought it was very interesting when you talked about how your parents never talked about the nature of the camps. And I've read that in other books and movies and things that I've seen, documentaries, where they always say they talked about the camps, but really the younger generation never knew what that meant. And I think that speaks more generally to the culture and people that were very proud to be Americans. And he was born here. And so it was shameful that his country had treated him this way. And this is something that I guess that you know, having gone with him and spoken about the case, I know he wasn't a public speaker and he didn't enjoy this, but the cause was so important because it wasn't about him and his family anymore. It was about everyone else. And so that's one of the reasons why I thought it was so important to ask you. And I have to say, day one that I asked, you said yes, to come and speak to us, to our community, and to my students, and to all of our attendees here today, about the importance of him speaking up at this time, not just for what happened to the people that were interred in the camps and their children and their grandchildren and subsequent generations, but future generations, given the political climate that we're in. So having explained everything that went on, which when you think about it is actually incredulous, particularly when you know, some of us, we all have, I guess some of us in the legal community can understand why these things happen, because we see a lot of things that don't always happen the way we expect them to. But you don't understand why there wasn't due process, why there wasn't a system where we had other citizens in the United States that were of descent from countries where we were also at war with. And the same thing wasn't done. And so that is where you kind of get the concept of racial profiling. And the fact that that's something looming over us. And you may remember, Lori, one of the dissenting judges in the Supreme Court, and I can't remember right now exactly what it was, said, this will be a loaded gun. And something that if you don't correct this wrong, we are going to see this happen again. And so that's kind of prophetic and a little bit scary to me, quite frankly, given where we are right now. So why was it so important for you to write this book?
So certainly that's a really big reason why I wanted to write this book. Certainly a real needing to talk about history and what happened to Japanese Americans, but really because of the really troubling continued relevance of those lessons today, when we still have ignorance and fear resulting in the targeting of vulnerable communities. So a number of reasons, and the first one being to remind the country what happened during World War II, the Japanese American community. It's a story about my family, a story about Fred and my family and my community. I don't want it to be forgotten. And unfortunately, what's really shocking to me is I keep on meeting people who've never heard of it before and can't believe that something like this could have happened in our country. When we started the case, reporters didn't know what we were talking about. They were wondering if we were talking about Japanese prisoners of war. And we were actually talking about Japanese Americans who were incarcerated on American soil. And so there are people who don't know about it or who know falsehoods about it, who believe that Japanese Americans were put away for their own protection, other types of narratives about it. But yes, going back to your suggestion, I wanted to talk about the danger of ignorance and fear, particularly during times of perceived crisis. So during World War II, people were afraid. Absolutely understand. People were frightened that the West Coast was going to be invaded by the Japanese. And so people turned against the Japanese Americans. So there was fear, and I could understand that fear, but that fear cannot lead to violating the civil rights or civil liberties of individuals here. And what we see over and over again, and I can elaborate on this more, is that people turn on vulnerable communities, communities of color, sexual minorities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, immigrants, as scapegoats. Often when they're feeling afraid. They're afraid for their economic well-being, they're afraid for their health, they're afraid that they're going to be attacked. And we'll get into the China virus and the anti-Asian hate, but again, that's an example. People are blaming Asian Americans for causing this virus. And so we see this, I mean, we know that there's an underlying forever foreign and prejudice against communities of color. When a crisis comes up like COVID or like World War II, they're often used as a way to scapegoat different communities that have been scapegoated through all time. So it's not like, all of a sudden Japanese Americans were bad during World War II. There was a whole history of anti-Asian hatred and sentiment against them. And then the bombing of Pearl Harbor was able to light a match and result in their forced removal from the West Coast. This anti-Asian history persisted afterwards. It persisted to the killing of Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin was a Chinese American, and he was beaten and murdered by individuals who were upset about Japanese taking American jobs and the success of Japanese cars in the auto industry, and they killed him because they thought Japan was ruining their lives. And that's persisted to today, to the anti-Asian violence and the anger at Asian Americans for causing the virus. So this is a long arc here. So I wanted to write this book to talk about that danger of ignorance and fear, about how Asian Americans are forever foreign, just like Latino Americans, like immigrants, that people of color, like Blacks, are treated as lesser and other. And so to be able to use the Japanese American incarceration as an example of this underlying racism that kind of permeates our society and what this country can do in its name. I also wrote the book because being a lawyer and a law professor, I wanted to talk about the role of lawyers and the courts. The story is about lawyers who really did bad things, who lied to the Supreme Court, who violated their oaths of office, and also about lawyers who did good, lawyers who spoke up, told their superiors to do the right thing, and then lawyers later on who went on to try, my colleagues who went on to open the case. And so I wanted to use this as a way to talk about how lawyers are not hired guns. We can't be hired guns. We vow when we take our oath to advance justice, right? And so it's not a win at all costs situation. But most importantly, with all of that, is I wanted people to know Fred, to know that he was a really good, brave and strong person, really gentleman with a dry wit. I wanted him to know, I wanted others to know the person behind this historic case. If I can say one other thing about why I wrote this book. One of the things in the book is that he and others who resisted the wartime orders were treated as outcasts within their own community. During World War II, Japanese Americans responded to their incarceration in many, many different ways. They responded, many responded, and in fact, the National JCL, the Japanese American Citizens League, took a position of compliance to show loyalty, that we have to comply with it to show that we're loyal citizens. But not everybody bought into that. Some people responded with anger, some people were hurt, some people were sad, frightened, many were just frightened. And so, and basically had no choice but to comply. So they weren't complying because it was a matter of one thing or another. They had guns pointed at them. And so compliance was kind of not a question. Many Japanese Americans looked at Fred and then Gordon and Min and others who were fighting their cases before the Supreme Court and fighting the government orders as troublemakers. JCL said it would not support self-styled martyrs, referring to those who were challenging the cases to the Supreme Court. When Fred was transferred from jail to incarceration, he was shunned. His family was disappointed in him. And then after the war, Japanese Americans who resisted were treated as outcasts. We've come a long way since then. In the past few decades, there's been a real reckoning and an understanding that people responded to this in many different ways, all of them certainly valid. So I wanted to tell his story so that people would know he was not a coward. He took an important position to say that this was wrong. I also wanted to tell his story because some within the Japanese American community did not think Fred showed courage. In other words, some of the other two other men who resisted as acts of civil disobedience. They wrote long statements saying why they didn't want to comply with the curfew law, and Fred decided instead that he wanted to stay with the woman he loved in the place that had always been his home. He chose freedom, which he was entitled to as an American citizen. Very small segment of the Japanese community, some people say that Fred's position was not as admirable as others who took a stand because of civil disobedience. And I really wanted to write this to explain why he took a position for freedom, and that that's very laudable and very admirable, to be able to live the way you've always lived as an American citizen. And also to say, he also did not have to decide to take his case to the Supreme Court. He didn't have to decide to reopen his case. He didn't have to decide to travel the country. But after he was arrested, he did. He decided to fight back. And so I think a lot about him was misunderstood and mischaracterized. And so a lot of different reasons I wrote this book.
And I can tell you from my personal reading of the book, and I've told you this before, I've read about Korematsu. I teach constitutional law. I read about it in law school. The book gave me a very unique perspective because, as you know, historical figure, someone that defied the relocation orders, and you read and realize this is not the person that I had pictured in my mind from reading the Supreme Court case, or because it really was difficult for him with his own family to take this position. And he wasn't a rebel kind of person, but he did it because it was the right thing to do. And so that's why when I was writing my introduction, I wrote that he was very courageous, because it takes sometimes more courage to do something like that than for civil disobedience. And going back to something you said, one of the things I tell my students is that the greatest challenge that we have to our civil liberties is that four-letter word called fear. And Fred was not afraid. So that to me makes this book very unique, and it also gives that perspective of what the Japanese Americans were going through within their own community. And he didn't even have the support of the organizations that were supposed to support the Japanese Americans. So he was kind of against all odds, even his own family and friends, and his girlfriend even abandoned him. So the person that he had sacrificed so much for was lost too, but he did it because he believed it was the right thing to do. And I think moving forward in dealing with racism in all its spectrums, as you were talking about, that's a really important thing that we need to seek, because, and I wanted to read, I told you I had seen the statistics, in talking about why it was important to tell the story and why it's important for you to be here today. It has been reported, and I pulled this from a recent report, that hate crimes against Asians in 16 of the nation's largest cities and counties are up 164% since this time last year. And according to the new study from the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, New York is actually one of the cities with the highest numbers. So in highly populated cities where maybe we're not talking about hate crimes just against Asian Americans, but against all kinds of minorities. And so in a world where there's seems to be a lot of hate, I think looking back at Fred Korematsu and using him as an example is crucial, which is why I thought it was so important to tell the story beyond what we've read in the case books, right? Beyond what we may have learned in elementary school or junior high in passing, and understand that yeah, this is a really dark period in our history, but understand that rather than just accepting it was a bad thing, we need to learn from it. And so I think that's why it's important, as you said, to tell the story now. So the next thing that I wanted to address with you is, so understanding that this is a problem that has many faces, how can we break this pattern? And I wanted to start, and I told you that I had chosen a quote or to read from Judge Patel's opinion. Judge Patel was actually the federal judge that to me is the hero within the court systems of all of this, because the Supreme Court, and to allow some deference to that, and didn't have all the documentation. And ultimately, the Korematsu case wasn't, and we can address this if we have a little time, it wasn't overruled, and not really specifically overruled until the travel ban case in 2018. So it was, that decision was out there. And it was legal precedent. And although it wasn't cited and the dissents were cited more than the majority, it is out there as far as I'm concerned, and a blemish really on our constitutional law and its history. But Judge Patel, who was the federal judge that overturned, vacated the conviction, she recognized what was going on. And this is obviously in the 80s, but she said, and I'm going to read from her opinion, which is on page 186 of your book. She says, perhaps what Korematsu versus the United States stands for, most of all, is a caution that in times of war, our institutions must be all the more vigilant of protecting constitutional guarantees. It should stand for the proposition or the caution that in times of distress, the shield of military necessity or national security must not be used to protect governmental actions from close scrutiny and accountability, and that in times of international hostility and antagonism, our institutions must take the leadership, whether those institutions be the legislative branch, the executive branch, or judicial branch, to protect all citizens from the petty fears and prejudices that are so easily stirred up during those times. So my question to you is, how do you find Judge Patel's statement relevant today as we seek to break very real patterns of racial profiling, which would apply to many races and nationalities?
It's so incredible that she wrote that in 1984.
Yeah.
I think about how we have to remain vigilant in our institutions. We have to hold our institutions accountable, our legislature, our executive, and our judiciary, to protect us and protect vulnerable communities. It's really incredible. She wrote it then. And so, yes, she saw, and I think we unfortunately recognize that the Japanese American incarceration continues to teach lessons today, and that it's important that people remember. So her quote talks about a couple of things. One is, of course, the need to be vigilant. We need to be alert when vulnerable communities are under siege, and we need to speak up when they are. And that's kind of got two parts to it. One is being alert to when vulnerable communities are under siege. We know now that discrimination and prejudice can be overt or covert, or less overt, I suppose. I mean, overt is when people make absolutely racist statements, right? But we also see discrimination and the targeting of vulnerable communities in less overt ways, and we need to be vigilant to be able to watch out for that. And so, for example, during World War II, the Supreme Court said Fred's case was not about race. It was about national security. So you ask, how can the Supreme Court say Fred's case was not about race when there was a whole history of racial animosity against Japanese Americans, when as a result of that animosity, people were calling for Japanese Americans to be removed from the West Coast, when only Japanese Americans were removed from their West Coast homes and sent to camps? Not Italians, not Germans, only Japanese Americans. And the court says this is not about race, it's about national security. So the response will always be, what we're doing now is not about race. So let's take the Trump travel ban, for example. It's not about race or religion, it's about immigration. This is not about religion or Muslims, it's about national security. Or let's talk about how something is not about being gay, it's about health. So let me give you a couple of examples and where that one comes from. For example, in 1988, during the AIDS epidemic, there was talk of quarantining people with AIDS. And members of the gay community were viewed as carriers of the deadly disease. And people were talking about rounding up gay people, right? An article called AIDS and Mr. Korematsu cautioned that Mr. Korematsu's case demonstrated that government power needs to be exercised very carefully when it's directed at vulnerable communities, because it's that loaded weapon, right? You already have an atmosphere of homophobia. Add to it a fear of disease, the government can overreach. During the Gulf War, the Japanese American incarceration was raised in an essay called Remembering Korematsu, which stated that the Arabs were the Japanese of 1991. Never mind that Arab Americans are American citizens and that they're more likely to be the victims rather than the perpetrators of crime. We've seen this happen when Muslims and those perceived to look like them are cast as terrorists and maligned based on their beliefs and dress, as persons of Mexican ancestry are branded as illegals and criminals. So again, the rhetoric is that this isn't about race, it's about protecting our country. And so I guess one thing I wanted to say about vigilance is to look for the more overt forms of racism, but also look to ways that people of color are harmed by, quote, facially neutral laws. We know that happens. So one thing Judge Patel is saying is about the need to be vigilant, but also she's talking about the need to speak up. During World War II, Japanese Americans stood virtually alone. None of the major civil rights organizations took a stand against the incarceration when it began. Many spoke up in favor of the incarceration. A few brave souls opposed it. But one thing to bear in mind is that the vast majority of people said nothing, and that we always have to be aware of acceptance by silence, complicity by silence, that by not saying something, you're letting it happen. Another thing she's talking about is holding institutions accountable, that's something all of us have to do. That's our job. Again, we need to speak. Nobody spoke during World War II for Japanese Americans. We need to speak. And I know this sounds daunting, perhaps, for me to say this to everybody. Speak at city council meetings, speak at school board meetings. I spoke at a school board meeting when my kids were growing up. Write letters to the editor, host programs like this. Thank you, Amaryllis. Share postings on social media that these are things that matter, that speaking matters. And of course, the most important thing is to vote. And help others vote. We only have to look at the news to see the ways in which the way we vote affects us every single day. Our elected officials influence our lives in every single way. They influence student loans, they influence protections for employees, they influence protections for tenants. So many different ways, and they can help inflame or they can help address racism. So voting for public officials, voting for judges matters a lot. We know the ability to appoint judges can affect things for decades and decades. Just this week, school board elections across the country. We're all involved in these conversations about what can we teach our children? And people are attacking the ability to teach children histories of racial minorities in this country. They're concerned that we don't want students to be taught about history of racial injustice in this country. Some of the laws, I read the Texas law says that when you're presenting issues of race, you need to always present the counterpoint of view. So how do you present the counter argument to slavery, right? So these laws are really these laws are coming out because some people are really concerned that it's painting white people in a negative way, that it's going to make white students feel really uncomfortable and blame white people for all the ills in the country. That's not the intent. the intent of having a classroom that includes the contributions of all people, including people of color, their literature, their history, their contributions to science, is to be able to paint American history the way it is, which is that America has been advanced by the contributions of many, many people, and that that America's history of enslavement, its history of mistreatment of people of color, is part of our history that we can learn from, like we're learning today, to understand it, to learn from it, and be able to not make the same mistakes again. And so I think going back to vote, you just had to see the election returns on, or the commentary on Tuesday night, to see how school boards are really absolutely making decisions about what we can learn in school and what our students cannot learn in schools. So, so certainly, I think what Judge Patel is saying is to be vigilant, is to speak up, and part of that is to vote.
Yes, and I, a lot of times fear is a result of ignorance. So it kind of one thing leads to the other. And I think that the distinction that you made between latent and patent, which is like kind of legal terms that we use. So things that you recognize as wrong, but there are a lot of things that maybe you don't recognize. And I reminded me of Justice Earl Warren, who became one of the most, civil, he was the one that was able to get a unanimous decision in Brown versus Board of Education. And it was responsible for so many wonderful civil rights decisions that we had coming out of the Supreme Court, but he actually supported the internment of the Japanese Americans, and later on went to say this was one of the biggest mistakes of his life. And someone that, was caught up in that, understanding later that that was wrong. And so it is very easy. And so vigilance, I think, is the perfect word, because we have to be aware, we have to be educated so we can be vigilant. So I think she was very prophetic.
Earl Warren's a really great example that none of this is really about blaming. So one of the problems with all of the individuals who are seeking to challenge the teaching of critical race theory in schools, which by the way is not taught in schools, their concern is that there's this blaming going on and holding the white community responsible for all the ills of society forever. I think what we're really talking about is education, and as you said, and really making people aware of how issues of race are embedded in our very culture for all of us, for me, for every person. It's in our language, it's in the movies we watch, it's in everywhere, and we need to be aware of where it arises. Earl Warren shouldn't have done what he did, but later in life, he realized that he was wrong. And I think that that's just a matter of educating yourself, of understanding that we're all part of this society that has perpetuated some horrible wrongs against different communities. And what can we do about it now?
Definitely. So I have a couple of questions that I think that you from some students. Actually, I recognize some of them to be my students, so I'm very proud of you all for asking the questions. One of them is the student says, I was a little confused over the military involvement of the Japanese Americans. I noticed the individual in the photo, I think it was your father, was a military personnel, and it was taken out and put into these camps. Would you like to address that? Because it's always dumbfounded me that someone that was placed in an internment camp still wanted to serve their country.
Well, there's several strange things about this. One is that first of all, that they wanted to is not strange. Certainly, as I said, a lot of people were talking about going to camp as a measure, as a way to prove their loyalty. Many young Japanese American men felt that the ultimate way to prove their loyalty to the country was to serve and give their lives for the country, and that would prove that they were loyal and that it would aid them in the future and aid their children in the future. And so many young Japanese American men went to war in order to prove that loyalty, and at tremendous cost. The 442nd, they were in segregated units. They were in all Japanese American units. Ended up being the most highly decorated unit for its size during any war, taking massive casualties. And there's many amazing stories relating to that unit. So what happened, and all this, of course, while their parents were being held in camp and while they were themselves prohibited from returning to their West Coast homes. The other thing that's just really strange about it is that they were, first of all, certainly allowed to volunteer to go into the service. That they were even allowed to when they were supposedly so disloyal that they couldn't go home was very odd and very strange. But then afterwards, even stranger was that they instituted the draft out of camps. And so there was a feeling that Japanese Americans should be subject to the draft so that they could prove their loyalty as well. A number of young men refused the draft, basically saying, as long as you're holding, I'll go, but as long as you're holding me and my family in camp, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to fight for a country that is holding my family incarcerated, saying that they're disloyal. And they were convicted of draft evasion and sent to federal prison for the duration of the war as draft resistors. So there's a lot of strange circumstances around that. The other strange circumstance is the military intelligence service, which my father was in, that of course the government saw in these young Japanese Americans the opportunity to take advantage of their language skills. And so my father started training with the 442nd that eventually went to Europe, but then was then transferred into military intelligence service with a lot of other young Japanese American men, which taught them Japanese and military Japanese, and then shipped them off to the South Pacific to interpret intercepted transmissions and engage in translating surrender ceremonies. So my father spent the war attached to the Australian Army. And of course, the big concern there was that they had to have protection because there was concern that the Allies would shoot them as opposed to shooting the Japanese. So there, as far as the military history of Japanese Americans go, they're a stellar history, really tremendous accomplishments, a great sacrifice, but also just bizarre circumstances as well. I hope that answered the question.
That's incredible. And I didn't know about that. I had never read about that aspect of it. It seems that the question of this constant desire to prove loyalty when you really haven't done anything wrong, but still trying to prove that you hadn't done anything wrong is an incredible thing. And I don't know that is something everyone would do, honestly. I have another question here. I'm sorry. Yeah.
And I think that I think it is incredible. But I also think it raises a narrative that's relevant today that confronts a lot of communities of color, right? Which is basically, do we need to keep proving our loyalty? Do we need to prove that we live here? I have no idea. There must be people in this audience here who've been asked where we were born. I certainly get asked it, right? So it's really just like constantly feeling as if you have to show that you belong here and you're American, and this whole idea of needing to do more to prove you're loyal is problematic.
Yeah. And even distinctions between whether you're naturalized or you're born here, and it goes on. I have another question from a student. As you mentioned, educating the public on the Korematsu case was another reason for wanting to reopen the case to clear Fred's name. Do you think the fact that the public has been educated on the issue, and we hope that's the case, and that specifically students are learning about this will encourage more individuals to speak out against this violation of our constitutional rights, as Fred did, if a situation like this were to happen again? And do you think that those that chose to speak out will be treated as outcasts by others that complied? So it's kind of a two-part question.
You know, I certainly hope that hearing of Fred's story and hearing other people's stories, people who have fought prejudice on all fronts, people who have fought prejudice against the Muslim community after 9/11, people who have been fighting the criminalization or the Black community, people who have stories of what they've endured in this system, to the extent that people can share those stories and people learn from them, that these are real people, they're their neighbors, and it could be them in many of these circumstances, will inspire others to act. Certainly, it should inspire everyone to act, but particularly people who are privileged and are in positions to be able to act. I'm a person of privilege. I'm a lawyer. I have some tools that are remarkable that give me access to justice in ways other people don't have. And so I think we have to think about that privilege we have and see what we're able to do to help lift other people out. So for the first part of the question, I really hope it inspires people that these stories mean something, that they mean something, that individuals can listen to them and see themselves or someone they love in a way that enables them to speak out. And indeed, the lawyers who represented Fred Korematsu continue to meet every single Wednesday, and we continue to travel the country or speak on Zoom now about Fred's case because it's still relevant. We've been talking about anti-Asian violence. We've been talking about Black reparations, allying on Black reparations, because Japanese Americans understand the need for and what reparations can mean. We've been around the country talking about Black Lives Matter and allyship and about the rule of law. We've been talking about how the role of courts in securing our rights. We've been talking about all these lessons that we see come from the incarceration because we think it's really important that people realize we've done this before. And these are things we can do to make sure they don't happen again. So the first part of the question was will it impact people? And I think the second part of the question was, what can we do about it? Maybe, or do we see change? Can change come? I have to say that maybe I'm too Pollyanna, but I think it can. I am so amazed. I was so amazed after the travel ban came out and people filled the airports. Lawyers went and sat on floors in airports with laptops seeking to help people the night that the travel ban was issued with signs in different languages. People went out to protest the travel ban. In Black Lives Matter, all of the demonstrations and the national conversation on race that I think that many people are engaged in right now. There's conversations again right now about Black reparations, which has been discussed for decades, but it never went anywhere. And now people are talking about it. I never thought in my life I would see gay marriage. It happened so quickly, at least from the standpoint of someone my age. So there has been change. It's definitely, we need much more, and change is slow. But I also think, what other choice do we have? You know, we need to seek that change. And to repeat myself, I do think there is power to voting. We've seen that in just the last decade, you know, that votes matter. We saw that Tuesday night when people were saying, well, the young people, you know, haven't shown up during this election, you know, they would swing it one way or the other. And so I think we can actually see that these things matter. Not as quickly as I would like, but I am hopeful.
And so in talking about young people trying to make a change and understanding that that's what you did as a young lawyer and the group of young lawyers, and it really is a fascinating story. And you all are in the book, you talk about how you were all in the house trying to write all it was divided, who was going to do what and who's going to do the research and who's going to do the writing. And the Korematsu family would give you food, like you say, and they were members of your family. But did you, one of the students is asking, did you ever face backlash during the reopening of the Korematsu case?
I don't think, we were very young and we were very idealistic. And so, and we believed we had an absolutely open and shut case. The documents we had were the government's own documents from the government's own archives. It wasn't like we were bringing in stuff the government had never seen. And so there's
and they didn't even rebut anything.
No, they didn't. So there's something to be said for being young and idealistic. I think that there was, so at one point in time, the former Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg said that our effort was ill-advised. And that was really very discouraging, not because we agreed with him, but because it was really like why would you say that? Why would you need to go public with that and say that what we were doing wasn't the right thing to do? So we didn't ever really engage with him substantively on it. And he didn't see when he made that statement, he hadn't seen the evidence that we had. He hadn't seen our petition. And so we got some pushback a bit, but it actually just didn't daunt us. My mother, albeit you might be interested to know, is that my mother was very concerned about me. My mother was concerned that we were suing the US government. And of course, she had been incarcerated by the US government. And I think all of our parents were really worried about us, which we kind of felt like, nothing was going to happen to us. No, I would say nothing that really discouraged us.
And when you say your mother was worried about you, it reminded me of when I've read the story of the Little Rock Nine that integrated the school. One of the big things was these kids are very young and their parents are very concerned. So I think parents are always going to be concerned every time their child is trying to make a difference or change. But I think being young and thinking that it could be done and having that drive to make a change is a very significant thing.
Well, and it's also kind of keeping in mind when my mother left camp and all these young people left camp, she was told not to hang out with other Japanese Americans, not to speak Japanese. She was told to be inconspicuous. And so she lived her life, and she told me she lived her life under feeling that she was guilty of a crime, and she had never committed a crime. And so from her perspective, I can understand that fear.
Definitely. A student is asking, and this is an interesting question, if Mr. Korematsu was here today, and I'm assuming it's a student, I'm sorry, not, what do you think his reaction would be to the recent anti-Asian sentiment expressed throughout the United States?
I can absolutely hear him. He would say he was disgusted. And he used that word. It was such a charming word to me because it was just disgusted, right? That it's not like stronger language. Be disgusted. He would know immediately that it's everything he fought against. I guess in some ways I'm sharing my own point of view too, that we worked so hard, Fred worked so hard to win his case. to talk about the danger of racism and about forever foreign, Asian Americans are not forever foreign and all of that. And so to see the attacks happening against Asian Americans has been deeply frightening and worrying, because for someone like Fred and for people who have worked on against racism, particularly anti-Asian racism, to see it come up this way to result in physical violence is really, sometimes it feels like no one's ever learned anything. And so it can be very sad. I can't even begin to tell you how the first couple of days after the Atlanta shootings, I couldn't speak. I just felt, I couldn't even put words together, because I knew that there's some people out there who just look at me first and they see me as something totally different from what I am, and that they're willing to harm me for it. And not because of my education, not because of anything I say or think, it's only because of what I look like. So I know Fred would be absolutely disgusted and feel as if we haven't progressed. And I want to believe that we can, and we have. I do want to say again, like there's been a great outpouring after the travel ban, like people have demonstrated in support of Black Lives Matter, people have come out in the wake of the anti-Asian violence to stand with the Asian American community. So that's more than there was before. That doesn't mean it's enough, or that anti-Asian sentiment has been buried by any means. But it does mean people are learning, and people are learning how to act as allies, and people are hopefully learning how to help change the culture. And that's something that I haven't said yet. But I think there's a lot of things we can do. Like I said, go out and vote, educate ourselves, do these things. But I think that the bottom line for all of it is that we all need to work to change the culture. And that as long as we have a culture in which this type of intolerance exists, things are never going to change. But if each of us kind of rows in the same direction to try and change the culture, maybe we'll just keep getting closer to things getting better.
And I think that's important. And that goes right to the heart of education, and not necessarily just education in the schools. When we think of education, and obviously changes need to start at a young age, so kids are aware of this, but education in general in the community. And I think, like I said before, ignorance breeds fear, which breeds situations like these. So one of the questions we have in the chat is also, do you feel that the Supreme Court should have apologized sooner? And I don't think the Supreme Court really apologized, but should there have been some type of reparation sooner, in your opinion?
I don't think the Supreme, well,
because the decision in the Trump case wasn't an apology.
Right. I mean, I think the Supreme Court said that the Korematsu decision was wrong. It said that incarcerating Japanese Americans was wrong, but I don't think it said that its decision was wrong. And a lot of people would say that in the travel ban case, the court basically did the same thing it did in Korematsu. That basically it turned a blind eye towards the discriminatory background, and it said it has no role when it comes to issues of national security. So it basically stepped back and said, you know, our role is really limited here, and there's not much we can do, even if there's all of this anti-Muslim rhetoric. And so it said in words, Korematsu was wrong when it was decided, but for many people, most people who read the decision, they feel that all they did was breathe new life into Korematsu. That basically it created it reloaded the loaded weapon, right? And so that in the future, there's a real concern that the court will again say, we have no role here. The government's saying that what it's doing against such and such is because of national security. And so the government should be able to do what it wants to do.
Right.
So I don't think that the court apologized. It did say it was wrong, which is good. But it didn't say what was wrong about the case. That's the problem, is it didn't say what was wrong. So I think the way I can read it is to say, let's not ever incarcerate 110,000 Japanese Americans again in the desert.
Or any other minority for that matter.
But it's not saying that, well, what happens when there's like 3 people who are put away because they're Mexican American, right? I mean, without due process. Is that okay? Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't get the second part of the question.
No, that was
Okay, yeah.
the question. I was just
Okay.
trying to point out to the fact that, yeah, what I think maybe we need is more direction in terms of what was done wrong, not the decision was wrong, but the fact, like you say, that there wasn't due process, because you need some guidance as to, we know it's going to happen again. Justice Scalia said, if you think that it's not going to happen again, you're kidding yourself.
Exactly.
And what is going to be the direction? What is it that we're supposed to do? What is going to be the mandate for due process, right?
Right.
And so I want to I think when you talk about education and awareness, I do think that's exactly what you've done here today. So I'm very grateful for that, because you've educated me a great deal, not only in reading your book, but in talking to you and in listening to you. And I hope that for those that are here today that maybe just heard about this case in high school or something like that, and not everybody goes to law school, so you don't get that second that more in-depth analysis of the case that we learn, and that we learn that Korematsu was not just about Japanese Americans, and Fred Korematsu didn't just stand for trying to correct what was done to Japanese Americans. And so I want to end this, since we're getting close to our time, and I want to end with a quote from your book. And one of the questions to you was whether, and then if after that you want to add to it, definitely would love to hear that. What Fred Korematsu told the judge, Judge Patel, and he said, and this is taken from page 183 of your book, he said, "Your Honor, I still remember 40 years ago when I was handcuffed and arrested as a criminal here in San Francisco. It was on Mission Street, that building over there. As an American citizen, being put through this shame and embarrassment, like all Japanese American citizens who were escorted to concentration camps and suffered the same embarrassment, we can never forget this incident as long as we live. The horse stalls that we stayed in were made for horses, not human beings. According to the Supreme Court decision regarding my case, being an American citizen was not enough. They say you have to look like one. Otherwise, they say you can't tell a difference between loyal and disloyal American. I thought that this decision was wrong, and I still feel that way. As long as my record stands in federal court, any American citizen can be held in prison or concentration camp without a trial or a hearing. That is, if they look like an enemy of our country." And I think you played a vital role in having that conviction vacated, not only for him, but in representation of the future of Fred Korematsus. And so I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I thank you for what you did in the 80s and for what you did here today.
Well, of course, what I have to say is that none of this is about me or about the legal team. It's really about Fred, the other men who took their cases to the Supreme Court, the people who went through camp. I have one of the members of the legal team, Don Tamakia, a colleague of mine. He gets asked, you did this pro bono, you didn't get paid for it. And he says, I would have paid to be on this case. you know, it's an opportunity of a lifetime. It was a privilege of a lifetime. And I don't, it sounds really trite and it sounds really funny, but I can't even begin to tell you how true that is. I mean, the opportunity to be able to address the incarceration of my own family and my own parents was an incomparable opportunity. I see a question from Elizabeth that basically said, how, as such a young lawyer working on this case so close to home, how did you separate your personal emotions from the case and righting the wrong done in Korematsu's ruling? There are times as a public interest lawyer or as a lawyer in general, where one has to grapple between how you feel about the case and the legal arguments that need to be made. I think all aspiring law students need to think about what they're going to do during those moments. We were so lucky that we had Fred as a client because he totally got that his case was about so much more than him. It was about the entire community. It was about the Constitution. It was about other communities. And he totally got that. And so we were really, really lucky. So for example, there's a point that you raised earlier that the government wanted the case to go away. So they offered Fred a pardon, which of course we had to communicate to your client, is to say, you know, there's this pardon and advise you about it and the case would go away. You don't have to deal with the case anymore. And Fred rejected it. He said, you know, famously, the government shouldn't be pardoning me. The government should be asking me to pardon the government for what it did. And we were so happy that he understood that there were no pardons here, that he really deserved to have his case heard. So anyway, I will say that to any, it was a privilege. And it's been a privilege being here today.
And that's what I was going to say. And it likewise is a privilege to have you here today. I don't know if you see another question in the chat that you would like to address. I think we've kind of addressed everything, not directly, but preferably at a minimum. So thank you again for being here with us today, for really enlightening all of us as to the very personal aspects of this story, but I think that you stand kind as a representative of many other individuals that you say, like you say, maybe didn't have the tools to go out, but were a very significant part of this in many other ways, sometimes just by being silent, but in each and every way, continue to represent what Fred Korematsu stood for. So moving forward, my hope is that what we've done here today has brought awareness, and your work continues to bring awareness. So I know that you continue to work with the Fred Korematsu Institute, and you continue to, as an attorney, represent individuals and those that are not represented in society, and those that maybe aren't outspoken, but nonetheless are suffering the same way that those that are outspoken are. So I thank you. And again, I am proud of what you do, and proud to call you a colleague. So have a wonderful evening, and thank you for coming to speak to our community.
Thank you, Amaryllis, and thank you everybody for being here. It's been wonderful interacting with you.
Good night. Good night, everyone.